what's going on, man?
How are you? Great to be here.
Dude, I'm so happy to have you on. I gotta tell you what, I am a fan of Mormons getting, you know, kind of more vocal, right? I don't care if that's LDS folks, I don't care if
Mm.
that's fundamentalists. I'm excited because quite frankly, I always feel like we need to be a little more forward facing on this stuff, right? Because like Mormonism's kind of weird, right?
Sure.
I remember when I received my testimony of the Book of Mormon, I remember I was like, I don't really want to be a Mormon. Um, because there's so much in there as a Mormon that has some baggage and stuff. And so anytime I see someone like yourself that jumps online and is willing to put themselves out there, I just think it's a great, great thing. What was the name of your podcast for everybody so everyone can hear it?
Angels and Seerstones.
Dude, that is a cool name. That is a cool name. What was the impetus behind this?
The name is just because it represents the peculiar, right? These are the
Right.
two sides, kind of folk magic and supernatural experiences that people might raise their eyebrows about. We've Christine and I have wanted to do a podcast for a really long time. Um, I think it was a 4th of July. We were doing a long walk in Provo to get to the parade, and we were brainstorming things as we went. And I said, we need to start a podcast named Angels and Seerstones. And I started sketching out some ideas, and then we put it on hold for several years. And then um, this past summer, we uh, we had a lot of time around a house. We were with someone who was going to pass away coming up, and I don't know if you've had that experience, but it means there's a lot of time. And um, we just said, let's go for it. Let's do something. And we wrote a few episodes, and it's pretty incredible. We were in the beginning, we were excited that we'd have 100 listeners, and now we're at 7,000. So it's a it's a fun thing, and it feels good to be able to share ideas. And Christine and I both are professional folklorists, so we write these articles for academic audiences, and they get 1,000 reads across their lifespan. And now and we spend 6 months putting out an article, and now you can put out a video that shares ideas, and it comes to its audience the next day. I mean, it's wonderful.
Yeah. I've listened to some, like one of my favorites was the episode you did on, and I'm going to try to remember how it was phrased. I might get this wrong, but uh pre-birth experiences.
Yeah.
And dude,
Pre-birth.
yeah, that one resonated with me so much because I'm a guy, me and my wife Amber, we adopted a set of twins 18 years
Oh,
ago now. And we had some incredible experiences. And as you were going through some of that, I mean, it just resonated with me incredibly. And so uh, that's the kind of stuff you broach, right? And some of it, and correct me if I'm wrong, this would you kind of like look at old Mormon lore, for lack of a better word, right? And you kind of look at that.
yeah.
What was the impetus for that?
We
What
look at the story. This is what I do. So I teach classes at Brigham Young University. I teach uh, contemporary legends. I have a class called Myth, Legend, and Folk Tales, and then I have an introduction to folklore class and an American folklore class. And every one of these, we have 6 lectures or so just on Latter-day Saint folklore, and students share stories. And what I've really found as a folklorist is a lot of the stuff I think is old, 19th century. People don't talk about anymore. And if they do, they talk about in hushed tones. Well, I think that's kind of true. But people still have these stories, right? People still have miraculous experiences. They've heard them. They're from their mom or their grandma or their missions. And they talk about them, but they don't talk about them at church, right? They talk about them at home around a campfire when they're hanging out with a friend. All sorts of different scenarios. Maybe you just talk with your kids about it. And that to me is really what being a Latter-day Saint's about, right? There's this official side of our faith, and there's also the side that we consider sacred. We keep it in small circles. And so, yeah, I love that sort of thing, whether it's pre-birth narratives or dream telling or even visions, right? All
Right.
of these are, or I have a lot of episodes on apparitions in the temple.
Hmm.
These are things people claim to have, and because we're careful who we tell them, a scholar could just assume these stories dried out, right? We haven't had a revelation for 100 years, sort of thing. But I think once you talk to people on the ground, you find out this is a vibrant faith that's still really charismatic. Maybe not as much as 1830, right? But
Right.
still going on.
You know, and I think as a guy who was never a Mormon at all, right? I'm the first Mormon on either side of my family. One of the
Yeah, me
things that
too.
one of the things that drew me to being a Mormon was this idea of no, no, no. These experiences that you read about in ancient scripture, they're still here, right? And you can
Yeah.
still have some of those, and in some ways, Chris, I feel like if we're not having those encounters with the divine a little bit, we're kind of missing out on more some of the cooler parts of
Yeah,
Mormonism.
absolutely. I think sometimes I meet Latter-day Saints who don't believe in the supernatural like I do, and I think, gosh, I have more in common with a Pentecostal or a Roman Catholic than this guy who doesn't believe in the sort of supernatural elements of the faith. And so I I think that's right on. Both my wife and I are converts too, and we both served missions, and uh, the life of seeking an encounter with the divine is why we're Latter-day Saints as well. So that speaks to me. And I think I know that there's broad audience in this show, but I think right now the LDS Church has never been more active in pronouncing personal revelations from prophets. We had a um, President Holland gave a talk at General Conference in which he very clearly implied he had a near-death experience in the past couple of years, and talked about that. I I think we've maybe from Wilford Woodruff. Wilford Woodruff talked about miracles constantly.
Mhm.
Um, but I don't know from Lorenzo Snow to Thomas S. Monson, have we had that emphasis on revelations, visions, talking to the dead, all of these things. And now President Nelson is speaking actively about that. It's kind of exciting. So for
You know,
me,
oh,
there's something
sorry. Go ahead.
very neat and at the core of our identity that's in those experiences. And sometimes we lose it, right? Maybe mid 20th century, we're not talking about as much, but I think it's on the way back.
I think, and certainly from my faith community, those things are picking up and accelerating as well, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of people I talk to, there seems to be an uptick in this, right? And it- it's almost like we're kind of hurtling towards an event, right? And there's little things that are beginning to happen where it's like, okay, buckle up, son. You're about to see some stuff. The show's coming, so to speak, right? And I find that extremely fascinating that you're seeing that on the LDS side. I'm seeing that on the fundamentalist side. And
Yeah.
quite frankly, I've spoken to people who aren't even Mormon who are starting, guys you never would have thought, right? Guys like um I have a next door neighbor right now. We're just renting a place, but he's a
Mhm.
Baptist, right? And we always have that uncomfortable conversation because I'm pretty much in the Bible Belt now, right? And it's like I see you dress up
Sure.
every week. Where are you going to church? And I'm like, "Ooh, well, you better sit down. This is going to be a minute." Um, but we had this great conversation. He's like, in our church right now, there's a lot of people who are talking about seeing some stuff that's kind of in the realm of supernatural. I was like bad supernatural, and he's like, no, that just visitations. And so I think we're all feeling this as time's kind of maybe marching on here a little bit. So yeah, I feel like all of us who are trying to find the savior, for some reason we're as time is progressing here, and quite frankly, just one guy's opinion, I think we're getting close to some major events that have been foretold in scripture. It's almost like these kind of manifestations are happening, and that's why I think your podcast is so timely, right? Because I think we have become somewhat removed from engaging with those experiences, because quite frankly, we've lived in an age where I think we've tried to explain everything, and man has kind of been like, well, we got this all figured out, this is caused by this. And so it's fascinating, because a lot of your podcasts, they go back a ways, right? They go back to the 19th century, and it's interesting to see how they handled those and they interacted with those as well.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's true. I think people are thinking about the supernatural, right? This experience, and I use supernatural to be the divine too,
Sure,
right?
sure.
This otherworldly. Um, I think Latter-day Saints are really cautious to say we're not weird, right? There's this
Hmm.
emphasis to say, hey, and I guess what I want to be is the sort of Latter-day Saint that never hides the sort of radical faith that is my religion, right?
Right,
There's something here I know you think it's absurd, not you, that angels show up to teenagers, but I think it really happened,
right.
right? So I want to own that, and I never want to be ashamed of it. And so the podcast plays into that. I don't have a testimony of any individual story I share, maybe a couple, but of the worldview of this idea, I really want us to grasp onto it. And sometimes we have lost ideas. These are people, as you mentioned, in the 19th century that had a very active experience with the supernatural. When they built temples, just like we do, they had experiences, they saw things, they heard voices. But the difference is they wrote it down and they talked to each other about it. And I think we're less likely to do that. And so I think today we do see upticks in that, and maybe it's because the internet makes it so people can again communicate with other
Hmm.
like-minded individuals. But something's going on for sure. I think it's a neat thing. When I talk about these experiences with students at BYU, uh, they're for the most part really open to it. A few of them will be like, "Oh, that really weirded me out, Dr. Blythe," but most of them say, "Oh, I had no idea." I've had several students want to write papers about how there's been a decline in spiritual gifts in the church. Like that's the premise of the paper. How do we explain this? And usually by the end of the class, and of course I tell them they can do it. By the end of the class, they usually come to me and say, "I don't think that's right anymore. I just don't think we talk about it." And so something shifts in their minds as they think about it. But pretty fascinating. That
Yeah.
tie with the 19th past is really important for us, of course.
Right, right. Let me ask you this. Why is it you think that maybe the last 50, 60 years, whatever it's been, I say 50 years, and I'm like, we're 6 years, that's 6 years away from the 80s is all. But we'll go back a little further, right? We'll say from the 40s to on to today. Why do you think we've been so
Mhm.
hesitant as a people to share those stories or those experiences with each other?
Uh, do you know, in my book, Terrible Revolution, I trace this idea of kind of an idea that if I have a spiritual experience, I should only share it with my stewardship, right? I should only share it with my families. I should only share it when I feel the spirit tell me it's okay in this setting to share it. I trace those ideas really to 1913. In 1913, we've already had statehood happen, and then the dream mine happens.
Hmm.
And this becomes a big deal. So there's an official statement that's sent out. In fact, in the book, I focus on three statements, right? 1905 is when we have a statement against the one mighty and strong. 1913 is this dream mine experience. And then 1918 is when Joseph F. Smith gets up and says, "Hey, I didn't actually have that vision that's circulating about me. And also, I know Edwin Rushton, and the White Horse Prophecy isn't real," right? So we have these three moments in which the church is kind of saying, don't trust unofficial sources, even when they claim to come from the prophet. If your neighbor comes to you and says, I had a vision and I want you to invest in my business, you can go ahead and tell him no. That you need to be careful about sort of messianic people that show up and say, hey, you need to follow me. So in this period, the period of transition is really focused on saying, hold up, um, we need to be really careful. And I think it's about being good Americans. I think
Okay.
our prophecy literature, for the most part, was about the collapse of the United States. And now that
Right.
we're part of the United States, it becomes it becomes counter the big project if we're emphasizing that the United States is going to collapse, right? And so by reining in these voices, these visionary voices, you can kind of control the message that's coming out a little bit better.
Okay.
And so I think that's where it started. And once those policies are around, we stick to it. I also think, there is this is it's I mean it's a practical rule. In 2023, I like when my neighbors might not, I want them to tell all their experiences to me, but maybe I don't want them to publish them far and wide because I don't want people to think their experience represents something I think, right? We're
Mm,
all Latter-day Saints. And so if Denver Snuffer shows up, maybe I don't want Denver Snuffer sharing all of his visions at church.
right.
Maybe I want Denver Snuffer to be told to chill out, keep it to his home. Um, but that is a problem. So I think for the most part, where we see this is that the church only really does something when visions push against the community goals, right? Churches
Right.
building temples. There's no problem if I say I saw my mother in the temple or I heard a voice say, do the work for this person. No problem for that. If I have a vision that says you're going to have a baby, nobody has an issue with that. But if I have something that says gather to New Mexico, then the church is going to have an issue, right?
Gotcha.
I'm stepping out of the thing. So I think it's really fascinating. And some people just go beyond that and think you can't talk about anything, which is not too different than, an individual who thinks you can't discuss anything about the temple.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. I remember, well, I'll just share one of mine, right? I told you I resonated a lot with those pre-birth experiences, so to speak. So,
Oh,
this is going someplace, so everyone bear with me out there. But we had just moved all four of our kids from Boise, Idaho to the eastern shore of Maryland. Not quite across the continent, but it's pushing it, right? I mean, I'm only short
sure.
by 300 or 400 miles going coast to coast. And we moved out there and we didn't know anybody, right? I mean, if you ever want to know what it's like to be in the Sanders family, we may get that bug. And you know what? We're going somewhere. Um, but we get out there and it's a strain on the kids, right? We're cognizant of that as parents, right? We're uprooting them from everything they know, and we're gonna go 2,500 miles to the east, and we're gonna drop shop right there and set up and go for it. And so times, it was a little rough on the kids. And so I told Amber, I was like, let's make this Christmas really good. We're making good money. Whatever the kids want, just get it. Right. I mean, they've been rock stars through this whole process. And I wanna make sure they know how much I appreciate what they've done here. And so it comes time and we tell our 5-year-old, Hannah was her name. I said, Hannah, what do you want for Christmas, sweetheart? And what do you want Santa to bring you? And she goes, you know what? I'm gonna get twin babies. Not I want, I'm gonna get. And I said, okay, all right. Well, we'll see maybe what Santa can do. Maybe he can bring you, a couple of baby dolls. And she got really indignant, Chris. I mean, she got way indignant. She was like, no, I want real twin babies. And I'm like, well, sweetheart, without giving a whole bunch of biology away here, that's just not possible anymore. Right. Like, the medical reasons my wife had to have some surgery. I'm like, look, that's just not going to happen.
Mm.
And she kind of walked away a little irritated. I could tell, right? She had her mom's look to her. She walked away from me a little irritated. And so, a couple months go by, and right around her birthday, I asked her again, what do you want for your birthday, sweetheart? She's like, I want twin babies. Now I'd forgotten about this, right? Christmas is in December. Her birthday's in April. She's like, I want twin babies. And I said, well, sweetheart, you know what? Um, uh, we can certainly see what we can go down to the store and find for you. And she said, no, they're going to be real babies. And this time she said they're a little boy and a little girl. And again, was just like,
Wow.
this is going to happen. And so a few months after that, I get the call from Idaho Department of Health and Welfare, Child Services. My sister had given birth to a set of twins. She kind of left him in the hospital and it was an emergency. So I they asked if we'd be interested in adopting, and because my wife is awesome like that, she's like, yes, absolutely we will. So I flew back to Idaho about a month ahead of time, bought a house, got everything set up. Then I flew back out, picked up all the kids and Amber, and we started driving out. And now when I get to Idaho, these twins are in horrible condition. I mean, absolutely horrible condition. And so I tell
Sure.
Amber, I was like, let's not tell any of the kids about these twins yet, because we don't know if they're going to live, kind of a thing.
Oh my
Um,
goodness.
and so the time in the month I was there, I would go to work and then go right to the hospital because I had nothing else to do. Right. I'm essentially a bachelor again in a 5-bedroom house with a lawn
Mhm.
chair, a TV, and some ESPN and an Xbox. Right? That's my existence. So I
Sure.
spent a lot of time up at the hospital, and as I held them, they started to perk up more, and things. They made great advances thanks to the doctors and some blessings and those sorts of things. So then we end up going to back to Maryland. I pick up Amber and the kids, and we're driving out, and we get to it. We were right on the border of like Pennsylvania and Ohio. We were in the Ohio River District area, or excuse me, Ohio River Valley area. And I'll never forget it. We stopped off at um, an old Ruby Tuesdays. And I was like, okay, we'll tell them here what's happening, right? Because they're not dumb; they can feel it. We're in a hurry. We're not hanging out. And finally, tell the waitress I want a seat in the back, right? I want something as private as I can get. And she
Mhm.
accommodated me, and she was super nice. And I get back there, and I just tell them, I said, hey, here's the scenario. There's these two babies that we're going to be adopting. And all of a sudden, Hannah lifts her head up and her eyes get this big. And she's like, twin babies, really? And I'm like, yep, absolutely, twin babies. And she's going, and she goes, one boy and one girl. And this whole time, I'm not making the connection, right? And I'm like, yeah, one boy and one girl. And she like slaps the table and she just says, I told you, I told you, you wouldn't listen, but I told you. I mean, she's shouting it. And so when I heard yours, that your episode on that really resonated with me. But
Oh,
for the longest time, I was scared to share that, right? Because one, it just
yeah.
seems unbelievable, and two,
Mhm.
um, I felt, if I share this, am I going to get looked at as a nut job? Am I going to get looked at as one of those guys, right? And so
Mhm.
that concerned me, right? Now, after a
Mhm.
time I found that no, I could share that, but it had to be the right setting, right? And I think setting has a lot to do with being willing to talk about these things.
Yes. You know, President Nelson, Russell M. Nelson, had this experience I talk about in the episode, right? Where his wife has met this child, this male child that's going to be born to their family, except she keeps having girls. So, eventually they think there's no way we're going to have another kid. And then it happens. And then Russell M. Nelson has a dream or some experience with this child right before he comes, sort of thing. Um, these are powerful things. I mean, I think we can trace them back really far in the restoration. God is all about family. So I, I'm pretty hesitant to share mine, but I had two dreams about my children before they came. One is my third kid didn't have a dream, and my wife is very upset with me about this. He didn't get his own dream, but he was born during the eclipse, so that's cool. But my first child, I had a dream. Kristen got pregnant, and I was late to the baby blessing. This is kind of a common theme in Latter-day Saint dream life, right? You're late to
Right.
your kids, men, late to the baby blessing. This is like our first responsibility as dads. We go in there, and I'm a chubby guy. That's the context for this. If you're just
You,
listening,
you and me
I look
both.
up on the stage. Okay. I look up on the stage and there's a chubby kid surrounded by others. I say, "Oh, that must be my son." And so I'm running up there giving a blessing. And a guy steps forward and says, "No, no, no, that's not your son." And they pull this little skinny kid out from behind him and puts him in front. I said, "Oh," and which is just fun, right? So I told Christine, "Well, we're having a boy." And of course, my son's like a twig. None of my kids take after me in size. But I thought it was fun. My next son, I had an experience that still really has a major impact on me. Um, I woke up in the dream, middle of the night. My child has already been born and it's on my wife's thighs. She's still asleep. And I pick up this baby, and it's a boy, and he has roots coming off of his head. Um, Kind of like he's part tree.
Right.
And so I wake up and I think, what is this? And I didn't know what to make of it. I thought maybe we're supposed to name him something, dealing with trees or roots, or maybe there's something else. But then when he was born in the call. And so he had the root of his growth, right? The thing that made it so he could get nutrients in his mother still wrapped around his head when he was born. So
Interesting.
isn't that interesting? I think there's just little signs. I mean, we're supposed to get revelation about the things that matter to us. And
Right.
I've never had an experience that says, start a business, or you need to move to this town to be safe. But about family, these are the experiences I regularly have, and I can trust God's going to give them to me. I think that's a very Latter-day Saint thing.
I
When
think
I
so
interview
too.
people as a folklorist, that's usually where they can pinpoint and say, "Oh, do you know what? My mom actually met me before I was born. I meet so many people at BYU who have a story about how their mom met them, which I think is very fun, right?
Right.
You think you
Right.
were the child of one of these visions, or
Right.
you were twins that showed up to your big sister? That's crazy."
Yeah. 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 No, it was one of those things that I will hold dear in my heart till I die. Um, and something that was really, yeah, absolutely. Let me ask you this question. As a man
Sure.
who's into folklore, specifically, Mormon folklore, what's the one
Yeah.
lore that we all swear is true that you later find out isn't?
Hmm. There's probably plenty of these. It depends on the era. We do so well in checking a story after it's big enough. And so, when did you join the church?
95.
95. So I joined the church in 95. I was baptized on April 30th, 1995. I was 14. And the story then I mean, it would start just a couple years later, and you heard it too, was generals in the war in heaven, right?
Right. Yep.
And the church worked so hard to squash this. And it took about a decade, but eventually, Boyd K. Packer gives that talk that's like, hey, when someone tells this story, you have to actually tell them it's not true. And I've never done that. I like people, I don't think it has bad principles to it or anything, so I'm not correcting people. But here's an example of that, just holding on. The the surety people bring us back in the day when we were baptized, we still thought Steve Martin was a closet Mormon, right? We
Right.
still we still had these things that we were all sure about. Oh, what else is big now? Some things I think we're so sure aren't true actually are true, right? So,
Okay.
uh,
That's an interesting thought, because I do think that in a weird way now, Chris, we live in an age of unbelief, right? I think we have seen a transition that happened relatively quickly, that
mhm,
but we're almost in an age of disbelief, and I don't know if that's maybe, I thought about this a little bit. I don't know if maybe it's because of all the tech. I mean, the tech we have now, like when I was a kid, there was no internet, right? Like my kids' minds are blown. I was like, there was no internet, there was cell phones, but you worked on Wall Street if you had a cell phone, and
that's right.
that bad boy was a brick that you carried in a suitcase because the battery had to be that big. And
Right.
so I think in some ways, the fact that we've had all this technological advancement, that quite frankly, I think, if people from the 19th century could see, they'd be like, that's miraculous, right? And so I think that it has maybe tempered that, or at least squashed it. But I think we are in an age of kind of disbelief a little bit there.
I think that's right. So often people will write me and say, I'm so concerned about this story. Will you debunk it? And I think, well, I'm not interested in debunking things. I'm interested in why things are important to people, right? As a
Hmm.
folklorist and stuff, and as a Latter-day Saint. So, I mean, I think there are dangerous things out there. If Chad Daybell stopped by my house, right, maybe I'd set him straight. But the average person who's really just trying to have a relationship with God and serve their family and go to church and whatever, I think they need more belief, not less. I don't know that the goal is that they should be super cautious with every story they hear, um, within limits.
Sure.
Um, but we are in a moment. I I really think, the opening of my show, we say the Latter-day Saint tradition is about universalism, apocalypticism, and radical belief. And I think that really is the key to our identity. When the rest of the world is beginning to question everything and change everything, we think, oh, God actually still talks. Um, of course, we think Jesus raised from the dead, but he's called prophets in our day too. And I think people question all of those things. Um, and so it's neat to be part of a people who are trying to hold on tight,
Yeah.
to keep that belief around. And when we don't have it, we probably should check ourselves a bit and say, wait a second, because that sounds like doubt, right?
Right.
When you
Well,
just
yeah.
question everything, I don't think that's good.
And again, I think that's the promise of Mormonism, right? I think that's one of the promises of Mormonism, and quite frankly, it's something that I see as a major thrust of Joseph Smith's ministry, right? When you get down to what he's talking about, he's like, I've had my experience with the divine, and you know what? You can have yours. And sometimes I feel like okay, two chubby guys talking. I know we can both relate to this. It's like if
Oh,
you
let's
went to
do it.
this great buffet and there's a whole bunch of steak, and yet all you partake of is the salad. That's just dumb, right? Um,
Oh, right.
and that's what I worry about is happening to Mormonism here is a little bit, is that we're leaving the good stuff untouched.
Did you watch Elder Uchtdorf's general conference talk a few years ago about he did a parable of the cruise?
Uh-uh.
Do you know this? All right, this is about a guy who gets on a cruise. He's never been on a cruise before. He's going across the Atlantic and he's brought enough food for himself, but just enough. He's really worried about money and so on. And so he sits and he eats his canned food in his room by himself. And eventually, at the end of the cruise, he realizes everything was paid for as part of the cruise, right? He could have been out having fun and eating buffets and he makes the exact same point that you're making there, right? We need to live up to all the blessings God wants to give us. And this is the essential blessing of the Latter-day Saint tradition.
Absolutely.
It's that God's and that we can be part of that. And I think you're right. I mean, the message of the temple itself is that we should be seeking after more truth, and God wants to convey things to us. And yeah, it's pretty awesome.
Absolutely. I think the other thing that is important from kind of a sociological standpoint
Hmm.
is that since mankind first started to gather around a fire, the thing that bound an even early civilization together were these stories, right? And we see this certainly in American history. I'm a huge honk for early in American history, like a nerd. Like that was one of the main reasons I went to Maryland, was to just immerse myself in it. And there's the story of Washington cutting down the cherry tree. Now we're
Hmm.
fairly certain at this point that that incident didn't happen. However,
Right.
there is what's that?
I said that's right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's 100 years. Our first account is 100 years after it happened. Right.
Right.
So
However, I think it still communicates some certain truth there, right? That Washington was a man of incredible integrity, right? I think that can
yeah,
be
we can be
proven.
about that.
And
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
it's through our stories, right? And we hope that we're only telling true stories. Now, inevitably,
Mhm.
certain stories get told that may be partially true or not true at all. And sometimes I don't think that that's with malicious intent. I think as things get passed around, the old telephone game, those things get told differently.
Yes.
But I think with a lot of these stories, there's always an echo there. I shouldn't even say an echo. There is a truth that is usually being communicated, and that may make us have to parse that out a little bit. As a guy who deals in that, how do you parse that out? How do you get to a point to where you can be like, okay, I'm not sure on the details, but I see what the thrust is here. How do you
Yes.
extract that?
So my principle, the way I principally do this is that I don't debunk. So I'm always, if there's a story, I'm always looking for why someone would tell it. Why would this mean something to them? And how does it fit in that worldview that me and my audience does believe in, right? That God speaks and that miracles happen. And so I take stories seriously, but I work hard not to say, I might tell you the first time we had this is 100 years after it allegedly happens. A great example of this is Messiah Hancock or Oliver B. Huntington. These
Okay.
are these great storytellers, right? Their journals are full of stuff, and I hope every word of it's true. But I doubt it because they
Right.
record incredible things and statements from Joseph Smith that nobody else records, right? But we have tons of journals. And so I started to think, So when I use those sources, I talk about ideas that were present. They think, one of the great quotes, I think it's Messiah Hancock, Joseph comes to him and says, I'm John came before the flood, I came before the fire, right? Like I'm leading the way for the second coming of Christ. Well, I think that's true. I don't think Joseph said it. And so
Right.
I think there's something about it where as a sort of historian and folklorist, I can pull back and say, look, this is an idea at the time. It's possible Messiah Hancock even believes, in his memory that this happened. Um, but there's just something about storytelling. There's something about the figure of Joseph. People sat down. We have so many, the rabbinical literature is just full of these stories
Mhm.
that rabbis told about the prophets, about the Old Testament, and they're really, really cool. And I don't say, oh, this story about Enoch is thus true, but I say, here's an idea that's circulating at that moment, right? And
Right.
then I can decide whether I like it or why someone would believe this at the time. Where's it coming from? Who would share this, and what setting would they share it? There's all sorts of those folklore questions we do, and that's what I have my students really think about in our classes. Um, and it's important that we just pull back and we give a little empathy to these folks sharing stories. I think it's tough to be a storyteller, but I also think we should be wary of individuals who are deliberately seeking to harm a faith community, right? So Mark Hoffman's the obvious example. Christopher Nemelka is an obvious example. Samuel Schaefer, who
Right.
uh, who went to prison 5 years ago, had written dozens of forged documents. I mean, they're just online documents, not selling them or anything, but alleged endowment ceremonies performed by offshoots and so on. Really fascinating material, but all made up, right? And so someone gets this stuff and then they think, oh, this is, in this case, I've had to correct people several times about different documents and say, hey, if your goal is actually to tell the story of this figure, you're using the wrong source, right?
Right.
And that certainly happened when we had things like the Salamander Letter or the Joseph
Right.
Smith Third Blessing, who've had major impact on the
Yeah.
faith.
And those are the dangerous ones, right? Those are the ones that end up doing harm. And
Yes.
that's something that I think when we're dealing with Mormon lore and um Mormon stories, so to speak, we have to be very careful to sort those out, right? Because not every guy telling you a story is a guy who um is sincere, or sometimes they are sincere and they're just deceived. I mean, that's the other
Oh,
thing.
yeah.
And so you have to weigh that out. And I I think this is really where you can use Chad and Lori Daybell as kind of a poster child, or a case study in what happens when this goes bad, right? And that's something you've covered as well.
Oh, this is so important. Right now, I'm if you watch any podcast on Chad and Lori Daybell, you're going to hear that their ideas are all from Tom Harrison and the book Visions of Glory. They want some direct link, someone to blame for this, as if Chad and Lori aren't good enough, right? Um, but so they want to reach out and bring in other Latter-day Saint stories and experiences that maybe were influential. But when I read something like Visions of Glory, I don't see the danger in it that other people do. I wouldn't subscribe to all of it, but I don't see it as inherently dangerous. I think things become dangerous when people actually bring the extremism to it, right? I don't think it's dangerous if someone thinks we should move to Rexburg. That's not
Right.
a dangerous story. But if you say sometimes kids become zombies, well, then that's a perfect point to say that's the sort of story you need to address, right?
Right.
If you think uh, God will inspire you to premeditate a murder, well, then yeah, that's a point that we should stop and say, what's going on here? Um, and that is dangerous. It happens in this case. My really concern is that all of those stories become such an LDS thing, right? With Chad and Lori Daybell. The same thing that happened with the Lafferty brothers, right? The idea, so Americans tell the story of a Mormon murder, and then they say this represents something about Chris Blythe and Dave Sanders, right?
Right.
Uh, they extrapolate that from it. And so one of the things I do with the Chad and Lori thing is trying to make sense of the stories that they're telling, where they're getting their ideas from, making sense of it, but also showing that it's gotten really twisted from a full Latter-day Saints story, right?
Yeah.
1,800 kids are killed by neglect and abuse every year. Um, that a few of those kids might be Mormon, and even might be done for psychotic reasons, probably doesn't tell you much about my faith, right?
Right. I've read, so as a fundamentalist, that's something I'm always on the lookout for, right? There's a dude down south named Warren Jeffs who did some damage, right?
Oh,
um
yeah,
I like, I know this is super unkind, but like, when I get to the other side, I'm gonna be like, can I just get one shot at him? Just once. I mean, just turn your head for 10 minutes. I just give me some time.
sure.
Lafferty brothers are another thing, right? Where
Hmm.
it painted the rest of fundamentalism in this light of they're dangerous, they're spooky, right? Now,
Absolutely, yeah.
truth is, it was one small part. Just like you can't look at Chad and Lori Daybell and then assign that to the LDS Church, because quite frankly, as I read some of the stuff, and I haven't done the research you have,
Mhm.
to me, Chad and Lori Daybell seem as bad as Mormon as I don't know, a good Stephen King novel. I mean, when you dive into it, it's some pretty horrific things, right? I mean, it
Ah,
doesn't resemble Mormonism that I would recognize from the LDS Church, from most fundamentalists I know. I mean, it bears no resemblance to the religion that Joseph would have started.
Dave, this is something, as we talk about kind of leaving the academic side here, when we talk about how to tell when something's maybe not right, discernment. Joseph Smith is emphasizing our ability to get revelation, and then he's emphasizing discernment, right? Try the spirits, shake angels' hands, know what they look like, all sorts of stuff where we're being taught to double check revelation. And I think one of the great ones, Brigham talks about this quite a bit, is when someone's revelations are really just about how great they are,
Yeah.
right? If someone shows up to you and their major message is that they're special, they're the one mighty and strong, they should be an apostle, they should be the future, Levitical servant, whatever it is, that doesn't make sense, right? The message of just, unless you're Jesus, unless it's the book of Matthew, like the message that you're special has never been the message of a prophet, right? That the
Right.
prophet himself is special. And I think we see this, and it's a really easy way to detect, like, oh, if every one of your revelations is self-serving,
Right.
maybe we need to step back. And that's true even of ourselves, right? If we're believing we're getting revelations, but they're really just about how great we are. And I think there's this in the LDS church, there's a desire from men to be bishops and stuff, right? And so they're constantly thinking about this. And in fundamentalism, there's sometimes a desire to be a prophet, right? To hold the keys, to be the one that's next in line. We have dozens of schisms and things. And I think those are easy to pinpoint and say, look, this is a really self-serving thing. And I think it's unhealthy. And so when I tell my friends, and I've had more than one who come to me and say, I think I'm the one mighty and strong, I say, I don't think you are. And I say it to their wives too when they say it. Because I think it's unhealthy for them too, right?
Yes.
Uh,
Absolutely.
but the general belief is my belief. I mean, I believe in messianic figures and that God's bring this all together for the last days and so on. But no, I don't think. I think this is something that's all the way back from the 1850s and before. Latter-day Saints we want to be part of that last days events. And so we think, instead of being like Brigham said, that great man that the Bible says nothing about, we want to be somebody specific. And it's certainly something I read a lot about. So
When it comes to guys, well, let me say this. When someone asks me how I'm so certain that the Lord was the one who inspired the Doctrine and Covenants, and someone says, how do you know that for sure? What makes you say that? Well, I've had some, from the spiritual aspect, I've had a spiritual witness of that. But if we look at this forensically, no leader who's seeking for just power would ever write documents in which the Lord hands him his rear end more than what
oh
Joseph
yeah,
gets it handed to him in the Doctrine and Covenants by the Lord from time to time. Right?
that's
I mean,
true.
the Lord gives it to Joseph a few times, right? So going back to
Mm.
this thing of self-serving, right? We don't get that out of the Doctrine and Covenants a whole lot. He does chastise Joseph as well as others from time to time, and it doesn't have that same feel. The other thing I would say is that um when it comes to the one mighty and strong, I've always said, if you got to tell me you're the one mighty and strong, you're not the one mighty and strong. I hate to break that to you, but that's just all there is to it, right? I mean,
That's
th- that should be readily apparent without you having to tell me. So,
mm,
yeah,
mm.
those sorts of things. The other thing that I've noticed as I've encountered a few guys who are off their rockers, they're really good too about not only having a revelation telling them how good they are, but sometimes they'll even say, "Oh, and you're really cool too," right? Like
Yeah.
I've heard this, and they'll kind of flatter you with that. Or another term is kind of baffle you with BS. But
Yeah.
that's kind of the thing. They'll seek to kind of vain flattery kind of thing.
Yeah. Dave, when I was 18, I was uh I was corresponding with a Latter-day Schismatic leader. And I can remember him, one, telling me I was one of the 144,000, saying, "How are you so righteous? You're so young. Obviously, you're one of these." And then writing me a letter about how lonely he was, being the only one to know he was a prophet, and how he needs me to get that revelation too. I thought, oh. And as of course, then I said, all right, I got to get out of here. But as an adult, I recognize that's really manipulative,
Yeah,
right? There's something about that. Um, I think that's important that we pinpoint the sort of the series of events that happens um for some of these moments. But yeah, you're right. Those are the things. People have revelations about themselves, and then they point to like immediate followers and say, "Oh, guess what? You're really special too."
yeah,
Um, and that's how you bring people in. Um, Certainly, Chad Daybell's a great example of that. In a couple weeks, I'm doing an episode on multiple mortal probations. I guess I'm calling it estates. Um, and talking about how he used sort of mapping out people's past lives in order to gain more control, right? To bring everybody in and let them know that they were actually his children in past lives and so on. Um, Really fascinating.
yeah. But that's something else I never, myself I've never bought into is the idea of multiple mortal probations. Because quite frankly, everyone who has them have either been Julius Caesar or Cleopatra, right? It's never like Mepos, the dung cart puller boy who gets run over by the runaway dung cart. It's always someone super important. Um, the
Mhm.
I've also said before, for guys who think they're really special and really important, they have to be crazy. Because as a guy who I try to stay very grounded, that seems like a lot of work. And that just doesn't suit who I am. I'd rather be on the couch eating Doritos. But that's just me.
That's right. Well, hopefully hanging with our kids, right? So like I think section 121 makes it clear, like there's leadership and so on is a whole bunch of trials. Like you got to make sure you're not being abusive and so on. You're not practicing priestcraft. You're not manipulating. And at the end of the day, the great thing we've been called to be as fathers. This is the restoration in action. You don't have to imagine being a bishop or a
Right.
prophet. You've already been given this work, and you can still get revelation for it, and so on. So,
Right.
mm.
Absolutely. As you've done your research on all these different lores, all these different events, what has surprised you the most in doing all the research? Because like your
Oh,
episodes average about a half hour, right? Somewhere between 15 minutes to a half
yeah,
hour, I've noticed. But what people don't
yeah,
understand is there's a lot of work that goes into that pre and post production, right? So there's a ton of research that has to be done on the front end. So in all your research, what's one thing that has just surprised you as you've gone through this?
Are we talking about the Chad Dable episodes or the other episodes?
What any of them, both of them,
You know, I love, I love learning stories that I've heard told to me by someone. The temple apparition episode's one of my favorites. Um, I once had this woman on my mission say to me, "I went to the temple today and the person really didn't want to do their work. And because whenever I tried to put on my clothes, they would be pulled back. Like she's like wrestling with a spirit in the temple." I thought that's the weirdest thing I've ever heard in my life. And then I found that there are many accounts of people saying just this thing. Um, and so often, the thing I think so interesting is that the story that I think is obscure, maybe related to just one person, is actually an experience and a story that resonates with us so much. That's actually been told many, many times, even maybe sometimes even when people don't even realize it, that this sort of experience brings similar stories about it and similar experiences, of course. With Chad Daybell, do you know the thing that has surprised me the most is all of the people. Well, I'll tell you this, uh, learning where Chad developed ideas. And so we're studying, this one guy and the terrible theology he developed that led to the murder of these kids. Um, but he's kind of just a sponge for ideas that he brought in and then twisted. And so, his ideas of four estates and exalted gods coming down, um, he's, he's practically plagiarizing this from people we can just specifically pinpoint, including people that I've studied in the past. And, on this reincarnation episode, I'm going to talk about a man I met when I was a teen who told me I was a fourth estate being and that I was one of the 144,000. And this man actually, I said, how is it? How does Chad Daybell's theology borrow from that thing I heard from this guy 25 years ago now? And just last week, I was talking to one of Daybell's former friends, interviewing him, and I learned that indeed he had found this man's writings. And they
Mm,
meant something to him. He was developing theology from. And so all the ties that you can find, and individuals who are out, unfortunately, they're seeking light, but making it very, very dark as they do so. Um, but that to me was shocking. Um, it's very interesting. And of course, the biggest shock to this is that this man somehow uh, had so many people believing he was such a great guy. I don't understand how that works. I really want to think that if you would harm a child, that there's some way I could see you and recognize the danger. And maybe some of us would have been able to, but it's sure a tragic story that so many weren't.
absolutely. And I think that's where this idea of storytelling can really kind of go off the rails, right? Because look, I don't know the Chad Daybell story and Lori Daybell story as well as you do, but I
Yeah.
imagine that it doesn't start out dark, right? It gets that way over some time, right? And so maybe while it might be a little fringe to begin with, it doesn't end at just being fringe. It goes in a different direction. And I think
That's right.
I I also I remember I heard my dad say something once, and he said, "A madman will always tell you who he is. You just have to be willing to listen." And sometimes I think that maybe not necessarily believe, but take them serious, right? You see something going in a weird
Mm.
direction. I think it's super important at that point to before it goes off the rails to try to get that guy back on track, right? Put an arm around him and be like, dude, you
Oh,
are flirting with some bad stuff. Um, and so that
yeah.
I think that's part that can be part of the danger, right? Is that you gotta be able to set some bounds and have kind of a a feel for when something's going off the rails. And I think that's hugely important when you deal with a lot of this.
In this case, there's energy work and reincarnation and these things, they might be a warning sign. They're not things I have subscribed to, but I don't think there's anything inherently dangerous in them.
Right.
But the second Chad Bell's The second, they're justifying an affair, right? There's
Right.
moments that happened a year before the murder where every one of his friends should have been saying, "What? This doesn't make sense, right? What? How could you reason this?" Um, so I do think we can show a decline, and I think it does start with, often in these stories, it starts with the revelation that you're really special, right? And
Right.
and and with that, it's not just that you're going to be a leader, but it's that morality doesn't function the same for you as it does for other people, right? Dave
Right.
Sanders needs to keep the chastity, but not me. I've had this revelation that I'm an exception. Um, so I think you're right. There are these revealing moments where people should jump ship.
Yeah. All right. I want to go back to kind of the happier side of lore here for a minute.
Let's do it. Yeah.
We kind of went down a dark road there for a minute, Chris. I don't envy you for having to do the Daybell stuff either. Let's just get that out
Do
of the way. Like,
you know the Excel stuff? I'm only going to keep up till September. It really bothers me. This is the third time I'm doing. I'm using this as a rough draft for a book, but I even named it a different name. So it's Angels and Seerstones is the big podcast, and then it's Demons and Pendulums is the
very
Chad
nice.
Daybell podcast. So
Very, very,
I want to make sure it's clear they're separate projects.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
I was
but
gonna
yeah,
say,
let's
don't get rid of those entirely because look, to be honest with you, I thought about doing the Chad and Daybell stuff, and I'm like, whoa. So when I saw you were doing them, I'm like, oh yeah, I'm just gonna point people that direction. I don't want to touch it. So good, good, good on you
well,
for
hopefully the interest dies down.
yep, yep, absolutely. So back to kind of the lighter side of this stuff. When when
Yeah.
your run of the mill Mormon has these experiences, what would you recommend they do with them? Right?
Mhm.
We've talked about there's kind of a time and a place
Yeah.
for everything, but at the same time, you can be too guarded in these things. So what does the average
Yeah.
member do with these things?
Well, I think one, we should write them down. I believe that. I think we should share them in our families. I don't think we have, I mean, I suppose there could be some things we wouldn't share with our
Mhm.
families, but for the most part, I think we want people to know about our interactions with God. Um, in fact, I was just got off the phone with someone whose father had told them about a vision that he'd had. This is a um, faithful church guy. The vision is just about sort of a spirit world thing. Um, you think about Russell and Nelson, right before he's called as prophet, does a Roots Tech meeting, a Roots Tech conference, genealogy thing, and he brings a vision that his grandpa had about the spirit world, about seeing his own father. And what he does in this meeting is he brings up his grandkids to read them this story. And so we all
Mm,
watch this. Um, and I think that was sort of providing an example, right? We share it with our posterity, we share it with our family, and this functions as a really sacred space. This is the home's a temple because we can do things in the home we wouldn't do in other settings, and it's a sacred spot. And so one of that is that we can share these great experiences there. I think you can also have moments where you build trust with someone, where this person, and in those cases, you might feel inspired to share something that you wouldn't share over the pulpit, right? Or
right.
write in a book. I think we should write them. I think we should share them. So we shouldn't put up these huge, never share them. Boyd K. Packer says that the key is to make sure you feel the Spirit tell you before you share one of these things. And when you share someone else's sacred experience, you make sure that they shared it in a public setting. You make sure that they're the ones taking the lead on how widely it should be shared. So if they only told you privately, of course, you would never share someone else's experience, right? Um, Whereas if they told you in front of a group of 10, 20 people, you might be able to share that experience at some future time.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Yeah,
Mm.
I guess that would be my thing, right? Like I think because we are living in the time we are, an age of kind of disbelief, right? Even within religion, which I find interesting, right? I've heard people try to I shouldn't say debunk, but maybe explain, how Joseph went about formulating the Book of Mormon and those sorts of things. And I'm like, do we need to do this? Right? Do we need to go down this road?
Yeah, we're
Um,
all skeptics.
right, right. Let's just let the history stand. Let's let Joseph say what it is he said happened. But
Mhm.
I guess for me, this is something that I don't think you should necessarily seek after, but when they do happen, I think as long as the message is one that promotes faith in the Savior, promotes,
Mhm.
family unity, those sorts of things, I think that those are gifts, and I think we need to treat them as such, right?
Oh,
I
absolutely.
I've often said, just like a jewelry box, I remember my grandmother had a jewelry box, and she would keep really special jewelry in there. And so it might not be
Mhm.
jewelry that she gets out every day, but when the occasion calls, it was there. And sometimes I think these stories are kind of like that, right? You want to keep them someplace special and safe, but you also want to wear them from time to time, and you want to be able to not necessarily show them off, but to put them on and to allow them to speak for themselves.
Love it. And we should learn these stories too.
Yeah,
Especially stories from the 19th century. We should learn them and be able to share those, and not be ashamed of those stories, of course,
right,
both our own and past ones. Yeah, I really like that. Jewels that we bring out from time to time, and of course, and the best settings are when someone wears their jewels. So
right, right.
yeah, that's
Yeah.
a great message.
Well, dude, that's good stuff. Where can folks find your podcast?
They can find it everywhere, but Apple Podcast or YouTube is what usually people go to. I think like 60% of our
So
stuff,
you
but you
do
can find it on
video or just
Spotify, other
audio?
things.
Do you do video or
We
just audio?
only do audio.
Okay.
We just do audio, but on YouTube, you can see a nice image as you hear
Nice.
our
Nice.
voice.
Nice. Yep. I did that for a while. I'm on Rumble. And I went with just the logo for a
Oh,
while
cool.
and yep, Rumble. Um and I did that for a while where I just had kind of the logo up, and then people were like, well, we'd like to see. And I'm like, really, once you look at me, you're gonna regret this decision. I'm trying to save you pain. But but anyway, I gave them the option. Um, but awesome, good stuff. Well,
My,
okay,
my wife is beautiful, so people would want to see her, but the contrast isn't something I want going live.
no, no, I will say this, but both the girls have declined. They went on somebody else's podcast, but they won't come on mine. Um, so take that for what it's worth. Um, uh,
Right? Well,
yeah, they
you
won't do
should
mine.
beg them. I
I
love
have,
the
I
husband-wife
have.
duo.
Because that would be a really good episode. I mean, that's like I could just turn on the mic and walk away. I mean, that's perfect. Um, but no, that's good stuff for sure, man. Well, dude, as these things keep going on, as you keep doing these episodes, let's get back on here from time to time because there's some specific ones I'd like to ask you about in particular. The three Nephites, that sort of
Yeah,
stuff, right? Get a little more specific. But I won't take up any more of your time tonight. I appreciate you coming on, man.
well, I'd be happy to. Maybe we should do a white horse prophecy one down the road.
Dude, that'd be awesome. That'd be awesome. I'm down. I'm down. Let's do that.
All
That'd be
right,
good. Awesome. All right.
sounds good.
Thanks again, Chris. Bye, everybody.